And we're live. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today here at GCP Live. My name is Anthony Bouchon, and I'm a customer engineer here and one of the regular hosts of the GCP Live and the program. And I can't tell you how lucky I am to be joined here today by Yuri, one of our hosts and sometimes presenter, right?
Yeah, that's right. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it. So my name is Yuri Grinstein. I'm also a customer engineer here at Google Cloud. And as some of you may have noticed, I like to talk about Stackdriver.
Yeah, which is what our topic is today, right?
Yeah, that's right. Those of you who subscribe to the GCP blog should have probably seen that they published an announcement that was actually made public at KubeCon in Europe. This was about 3 weeks ago, that there was a new set of functionality in Stackdriver, specifically around the monitoring of Kubernetes, both in GKE and then in just a little bit, it'll be rolled out to actually non-GKE clusters as well. That functionality is in beta, but I was really excited about it. I spent a few minutes with it, trying to kind of understand how to get it. What it is, what it does, and what some of the differences are between kind of what Stackdriver was doing for GKE and what it's doing now.
Yeah.
And yeah, we didn't want to wait. We wanted to bring it to you right away. So
yeah,
thanks for being with us.
I think that's going to be a pretty big thing, and as far as clarifying, what's actually new here, because Stackdriver is something that's been synonymous with logging and monitoring on Google Cloud Platform. So what does this actually bring to Kubernetes, and then I guess Kubernetes engine? So I don't want to waste any more time, Yuri. Let's see what you got.
Yeah, man. Let's get right into it. All right. So let's kind of start with the way we always start, which is basically we're going to tell you what we're going to tell you. So Stackdriver monitoring for Google Kubernetes engine and actually third-party or hybrid Kubernetes is currently in beta. And so the big difference between what you are getting with basically, I'll call it legacy, although obviously that's sort of an unfair term to use. But let's say with legacy monitoring and what you're getting with current monitoring is that the collection mechanism is somewhat different. So we're actually going to be collecting heapster metrics, and I'll actually go through the architecture in just a second. And there's actually out-of-the-box Prometheus integration. So those of you that are running Prometheus for monitoring today, there's actually a native Prometheus metrics that are being collected, and I'll show you kind of what those look like as well and how to take advantage of them.
That's awesome. I think that definitely addresses the concern of, or the feature of bringing this to clusters outside of GKE as well.
Yeah.
So I think that there's a lot of open source kind of instrumentation that has found its way into different clusters, and certainly Stackdriver doesn't want or wants to be available to those users as well.
Absolutely. I mean, Stackdriver's like genesis was basically for hybrid monitoring, right? When it was first created, and still to this day, right? You can use it to monitor stuff in GCP, but you can also use it to monitor stuff in AWS. And that sort of hybrid monitoring story is, made even stronger by being able to basically monitor Kubernetes no matter where it's running. All right. So again, this is a beta release. So the beta release is specifically for GKE. That's where we're starting out. But it's going to be expanded to cover. So for example, if you want to stand up your own Kubernetes cluster on Compute Engine, there'll be support for that. And then obviously after that, it's really sort of doesn't matter where things are running. You'll be able to monitor them. Sweet. And if you can go to our external site, cloud.google.com/Kubernetes monitoring. You'll see basically an overview and the documentation of how to get started.
Awesome.
All right. So obviously the first question people are going to ask is like, all right, this thing is in beta. How do I get it? How do I opt in if I actually want to try this for myself? Well, thankfully, the product folks have made this really easy to take advantage of. Two different options. If you creating a cluster from the command line, you basically use the beta flag, and then you just use the enable Stackdriver Kubernetes flag when you create the cluster. So kind of basically three things to note in the command line command here. One, you need to use the beta flag in gcloud. You need to use basically the latest available version of Kubernetes, which is 110 and basically later. At this point, we're not yet exposing this for basically earlier versions. And then the sort of the key flag that actually turns it on is enable Stackdriver Kubernetes. If you're doing this through the console, it's as straightforward as enabling the try the new beta monitoring and logging experience when you're creating the cluster. So pretty straightforward.
From this perspective, so at cluster creation time, I assume that when you have this flag enabled or click this little checkbox, something is deployed into your cluster to hook into this new kind of monitoring and logging experience.
Yeah,
right?
so that's like the sort of the how of it question. So yeah, that is absolutely correct. And actually, before we get into that, what I wanted to show you first is like what you're actually getting.
Sure.
So what is it that you're getting? Well, so what you're actually getting is a totally different view of Kubernetes within Stackdriver than what was there before. You'll actually have 3 different ways of viewing your cluster. You can basically look at it from an infrastructure perspective, from a workload perspective, or from a service perspective. So that all sounds good and well. You know what? Let's get into it, and I'll show you exactly what that looks like. So here is Stackdriver. This is probably a view that you're familiar with, right? You've seen this before.
Yep.
And this is, and now if within Stackdriver, I can go to under infrastructure and I can go to Kubernetes engine.
I like how we're just skipping past the fact that you have a few-week-old incident that's still open. It's not a production.
Clearly, I am running mission critical workloads in my cluster.
Clearly.
So here's a cluster. This is a, you can see this is a 197 cluster, right? Okay. So sort of before the, an earlier version. And this is a view that if you've been running Kubernetes engine in GCP and you've been using Stackdriver to monitor it, you're pretty familiar with, right?
Right.
So I've got some node information over here on the right-hand side. I've got my cluster details and I've got my pods, right? And as you can imagine, if this is a cluster with a whole lot of pods on it, this can get a little messy, right? This view is a little hard to follow. Sure. I can, click on a particular pod. So here's like some Python logging code that I deployed, and I can, get more information about that pod. So I can see what containers are within that pod. There's a lot of them. Again, it's sort of hard for me to see anything specific about them. So I can say, all right, well, let's look at like my Python logging container, and then you're sort of drilling down, but you're kind of losing where you were, right? So there are breadcrumbs up here, so I can kind of keep track of where I've been.
Sure.
So if I want to get back to something, that's all there. And then I can see, okay, details about my container, some metrics that are being collected, right? So I can see, okay, what's like the disk use for that particular metric.
Okay.
Right.
But for the most part, this looks like
straightforward.
It's kind of an organization of here's like infrastructure and then some stuff running on the infrastructure.
Yeah.
A little less aware of Kubernetes objects.
I think that's a good way of putting it, right? And I think the key thing that you kind of nailed down here is that there's really only one way of looking at this, right? So if I go back to my cluster, right, it's the pods, right? So I'm going from cluster right to the pods.
Right.
I don't really have visibility into the workloads, right? I can't really see the services that are running. I certainly don't have information about, daemon sets or any of the, none of the Kubernetes stuff. It really shows up here. So now let's take a look at what it looks like when you use the new features. Okay. And I'm going to go back to the resources menu here. And you can see that under resources, I actually have a couple different options. Under infrastructure, I have Kubernetes engine, which is what I just selected. Right. And that's basically your quote unquote legacy view.
Right. And this is actually, that's a good clarification point. Even this is only for GKE clusters.
That is correct. That is correct. Which is like a big limitation of it, right? Sure. So if you were running Kubernetes yourself, either on Compute Engine or anywhere else, you really do not have like Kubernetes visibility.
Yeah.
Right. So that's where you had to run Prometheus and kind of do your own monitoring, basically.
And I'll take you one further. Even if, I think multi-cluster is something that we're starting to see a lot more, at least anecdotally with my customers. And so when you look at that, and we tried to use this pre kind of Stackdriver current status today, we're not able to have the same kind of tooling for our different clusters.
Right, exactly. And now your hybrid cloud story starts to fall apart a little bit, right? So you can say, sure, you have the same infrastructure on-premise in AWS and in GCP. Yeah. You can use the same deployment tools and all that sort of thing. Oh, but monitoring is different, right? So you got to use Prometheus everywhere else, and then Stackdriver and GCP, or you sort of give up on Stackdriver entirely and just use Prometheus everywhere.
Right.
But then, the federation of that data is not trivial as well.
All right, I'm hooked.
Right. So you're sold, right?
You want this.
All right. So the way we fix it is by using the new Kubernetes monitoring in Stackdriver. So now you can see there's another option here, clearly labeled as beta. So if you're running production workloads, just take this as a caveat. And Kubernetes is an option now under GCP. Okay. So I click on that, and now you see that this is my Kubernetes view, and now my view looks quite different. So the first thing that jumps out at me is that I've actually got all of my monitored clusters in a single place, right? I don't have to go sort of look at one cluster at a time.
Sure.
For each cluster, I've got some basic metrics, so I can see things like how many pods are ready, do I have any incidents, what does my CPU and memory look like? All that is sort of easily available,
okay.
And that can start drilling into this. And the way that things are going to be organized within here is a matter of which of these views I'm looking at.
Okay.
And before I actually get into it, you see there's also a timeline up here. So what we're going to be building, and again, because this is beta, some of the stuff is sort of in flux, is we're actually going to be tying events to metrics for the first time.
Okay.
And what that really means is that if there are incidents within my clusters, they'll show up on a timeline, and I'll be able to click down on that event and see the state of my metrics at that time.
That's pretty cool.
And then further down the road, there'll be things like deployments, for example. So I can say that, hey, I deployed something, and that may or may not have affected the behavior of my cluster, the workloads in my cluster. So all of that stuff is sort of in the, as I understand it, in the design stage. Again, not from the product team. I'm a user of this and a fan, not a builder of it, but this is kind of how I understand things to be shaping up. But anyway, so we've got our clusters, right? So I've got three clusters here. So let's go down the infrastructure path, right?
Yep.
So if infrastructure, right, under cluster, you would expect to see the nodes. And sure enough, here are my three nodes. I can see how many pods are running on each. I can see if any of the nodes have incidents, right? Okay. So now I'm starting to get a little more granular. And within a particular node, I can see all the different pods that are running, right? And all of the different, within each of those pods, I can see obviously the containers that are running, and for any of these resources, if I click on them, so if I click on a node, for example, you'll see it'll actually show. This is basically another window that shows me more information. So again, some of the stuff is being built out, right? For nodes, I don't really have a whole lot of data coming in. But
can I ask? We do see incidents here. So does this hook into the rest of, let's say, Stackdriver's features to then
absolutely
create incidents, alerting policies, and define what these incidents look like?
Absolutely.
Information here.
That's exactly correct, right? So these incidents are going to be your Stackdriver monitoring incidents, right? So all of these metrics that are being collected are going to be available for alerting policies. You'll be able to define, how incidents should be created from those alerts.
Sure.
And do notifications and all that sort of thing.
Okay.
Everything, everywhere. So, and then what I was saying is there's actually additional metrics available. Obviously, these are just kind of your high-level metrics, but I can click on the pod, for example, to bring up sort of the pod-specific views. I can see when container starts took place, how much memory the containers within this pod are actually using, right? I can see CPU utilization, and all this information is easily available. And I can even go down here where there are actually logs being pulled from that pod,
nice.
right?
Okay.
So now I'm getting metrics and logs basically within a single UI, right?
That's so cool.
Yeah, that's super useful if you're doing troubleshooting, right?
It is. Absolutely.
If something's broken, if a container is crashing, it's really handy to have this right here without having to, like for the first time, we're really starting to unify logging and monitoring in the same view, right? Because if you think about the way that logging works today, logging really lives in the GCP console, right? It doesn't even live in Stackdriver.
Cloud logging.
Yeah, it's called logging, but it's in the console. It's not in Stackdriver at all. Right. So if you're trying to figure out, okay, I had some metrics that changed, like what were the logs at that time? It's really difficult to do that if you don't have that within a single view. So this just makes it a lot easier, right? And now it's just sort of pulling the latest logs, right? It's not necessarily like streaming logs, but you can see this sort of the shape of things start to emerge, right? You can see where this is going. You can see how much more useful,
absolutely,
up to now. And this is just information for the pod. Then I can continue to drill down. So obviously I can pull up information for the container. again, I can see memory, CPU, and the logs. Now I can see container level logging as well.
Got it.
All right. So all that just makes life much easier. So that's like the infrastructure view. The other views aren't terribly different, but I can go to workloads, and now within my cluster, I can start to see things like the namespaces. Within each namespace, I can see the workloads that are actually running.
Wow.
Right. So taking advantage of the Kubernetes Workloads API.
Yeah.
And then within each one of those, continue to. So let's say, where's my, I'm actually not running any real workloads. I've just realized that I've never actually deployed anything to this cluster.
Well, let me try and see if I'm following along here. What's really cool here is it seems like these different types of views, right? We have infrastructure, we have workloads. I'm excited to see what services have, but they seem to be geared towards any member of or members of different teams.
Yeah.
Right. So on infrastructure side, we may be more concerned from a cluster operator, but then looking at workloads and understanding natively, hey, here are the namespaces and here are the different workloads running in each namespace. So let's say like a team or a company gives each team its own namespace. Now an application developer, I can go and look at, all the different applications in my namespace that maybe comprise my call stack, and I can kind of get a full view here, because that was kind of not present where you just see all the pods.
Exactly. You just see a long list of pods, and you can see for something like this where you have a lot of the, you probably have the bit of language to describe this, but like the system stuff, right? It's not like the user workloads. It's sort of the stuff that you need to keep Kubernetes running. If it's just a long list, right? So it's really hard to know, like, what is it, the things that I care about.
Oh yeah.
And then
you see a ton of stuff that isn't relevant.
Exactly. So
Right.
this, I think that, I think you hit it right. It makes it easier for you to see kind of what is going on.
Cool.
And you really focus on those things that, like you actually care
And then
about.
if we actually drill down, we get the same kind of like, here's pod level metrics.
Exactly. So I can, obviously I can expand the pod. I can see the containers running within that pod. I can click on the pod and get the same metrics. I can click view logs, and it should take me right to the logs there as well. So all of that is, the functionality is basically the same. It's just it's really a question of how do you want to look at it. But how you want to look at it matters depending on what your job is.
Of course.
And just like you said. And then the final view here is going to be our services view, right? So as you can imagine, if I drill into a cluster here, I still have namespace is my first level, and then under that I'm going to have the actual services, right? And then behind services, so if we look at Heapster, for example, you'll have the pods and then the containers that make up that, right? So if I actually had any like real workloads on this cluster, if I had deployed anything, I would have probably created a deployment, and then fronted that deployment with a load balancer, and I would be able to actually see that in here, right? Whereas like the quote unquote legacy Stackdriver monitoring just does not give you an easy way to do that.
Right. And even then we didn't have that view of the concept of services, right? Like we weren't, I think that services are really good from an understanding the convention or like the instance of the application, as opposed to like a pod is like not a good representation.
And to be fair, like let me actually switch to the console itself, right? To be fair, I can go to the console, and a lot of that information is available, right? So I can go to services, for example, and I can say, okay, here are the Kubernetes services, right? So I've got sort of the service that I actually deployed on my logging cluster, and then Prometheus running my Prometheus
cluster. You have a Hello World app running.
Yeah, you know what? I was actually looking at I should have looked at that cluster. So, but then you sort of have to say, okay, well, here are the services. I can tell you which cluster they're running on, but I don't, and the namespace they're running in. But then, you sort of have to drill down from there, right? So I have my workloads, and here's all the different workloads that are running.
Yeah, and I'm a huge fan of the actual GK UI too, mostly because I think that, when I think of this, initially I think of the Kubernetes dashboard, but that's scoped to like a single cluster.
Right.
Plus there's a lot of, I think, best practices around how to secure that properly. Yeah. But instead, here I'm able to look across multiple clusters that I'm running. I think the key that I keep coming back to here with Stackdriver though is even from this, I'm not getting that level of like, where's my one view if I'm trying to debug, trying to figure out what's going on, read events from a container, understand where it's running, what kind of controller is deploying that pod and stuff like that. Stackdriver gives us all of that in one place. So, I mean, this is awesome too from like just understanding kind of what's in your cluster. But again, from when we're talking in the space of logging and monitoring.
Yeah, exactly.
It's pretty big.
Yeah, and the Cloud Console probably isn't something that you use every day if you're, like an SRE, right?
Sure.
I mean, you probably have visibility into it. You can use it to understand like what's been deployed and kind of what is where, but you need something that is really focused on monitoring in order to be able to like run your stuff in production.
Right.
Awesome. All right. So that's the sort of the short overview of like what the new Stackdriver monitoring for Kubernetes looks like.
Okay.
But now I do want to come back to something, which is a question that you asked sort of before I got into this, which is like what's actually being deployed, right? Mm-hmm. So if we go back to kind of where I started, right? Let me go back into presentation mode, and the way you get this, right, is you create a, at this point, it's only because it's in beta, it's only for new clusters, right? So you can't take an existing cluster and basically upgrade it. You have to create a new cluster. And when you create a new cluster, you enable the monitoring. So your question was, all right, when I do this, like what's actually being deployed, mm-hmm. right? Great question. Like how does this actually collect the metrics? Well, how does it work, right? Some of this may be familiar, right? So we've got our Kubernetes master here, and we've got the cluster, right? Mm-hmm. So what's actually happening is that we're creating a new namespace called Stackdriver agents, okay, right? And within that namespace, we're deploying really four main things that weren't there before, right? We're deploying two new, how do we say it? Is it daemon set or daemon set?
Daemon set?
Daemon?
I always kind of say it in the middle.
In the middle, daemon set. One for logging and one for metadata. And we're actually then creating a deployment as well, specifically for metadata. Okay. Then we're creating another deployment specifically for Heapster to basically talk to the monitoring API and then like extract the metrics and send them to the API, right? Right. So you see this is actually quite a bit different than the way that things used to work, right? If you look, and I actually want to show you the difference between what a quote unquote legacy cluster looks like, what a current cluster looks like. We're now running the logging and basically we're running the logging agent as a daemon set. Mm-hmm.
So just to level set, daemon set is something where it gets deployed on every single node, mm-hmm. let's say in the cluster or something.
Yeah, exactly correct. Yeah.
One pod per node.
That's right. And so that's actually the same as it was in legacy cluster, right? We're using the Fluentd based logging agent. But now the monitoring is now being collected by Heapster, and it's talking to the monitoring API. All right. And then there's a third thing, which is the metadata agent, which
seems to be entirely new.
Yeah, exactly. That's the big thing that's enabling all of this like Kubernetes specific intelligence with the monitoring.
Okay.
Right. So let's see if we can show you the difference. I want to show you kind of one more thing. So I've got a couple things here. So let me first, here you can hopefully still see this. So I've got, I'm actually going to start where I was. So within Cloud Shell. Mm-hmm. So let's see. So where am I, right? So kubectl config current context shows me which cluster I'm actually connected to in kubectl. You can see this was called logging. So project the Stackdriver Kubernetes in US West 1A called logging cluster. Yep. Right. As a reminder, if I go to Kubernetes engine and I go to my Kubernetes clusters, you'll see that logging cluster is not an alpha cluster. Mm-hmm. Right. It's a current state. Everything is GA. So let's take a look at what we've got there. Right. So if I do kubectl get pods, right, that should. Yeah, nothing found. Get name. Space as well. Yeah, there's nothing found because I'm actually not running anything in there.
So I think we're still seeing your console.
Oh, okay. So this is, all right, let's see if we can figure this out.
Looks like you popped out the Cloud Shell.
Yeah.
Which is a really cool feature.
Yeah.
Breaks Hangouts a little bit.
Let me try and. Let's see if this works. No, it's upside down.
No worries.
All right. Well, we may not be able to. Let's see. Let me just share a specific. Well, you know what? I'm gonna have to just share one window at a time.
Yeah.
Okay. Does that work?
Yes.
Okay, very good. All right, so let's do that again. Let's get the namespaces.
Yep.
So on my
this is your pre-Stackdriver.
Yeah, no, you want. I'm sorry, I'm getting a little out of source here. This is actually the current one, right?
Okay.
But I think what I can actually do, conceal get name, get pods dash n Stackdriver agents. Let's just look at the new one, right? Oh, you know. You know this better than I do, Anthony.
So
how do I? What am I missing?
Let's look at the name of our clusters again.
Okay.
Yeah. So let's go back to the console, or just you and I can look at it.
Sure.
To the Cloud Console page.
Okay.
Let's see. So let's switch into.
Okay, it's a monitored cluster. It is my alpha cluster.
Click on alpha cluster.
Okay. Click on. Okay, so I'm not in alpha cluster. I am basically using monitored cluster as to want to show. That's where I want to show the new Kubernetes monitoring.
I see.
And then logging cluster is basically the legacy one, right? But let's take a look at. Let's do it. Maybe we can do it through here, right? So if we go to workloads and we go to our let's sort it by cluster, you can see logging cluster has.
So let's switch over to this screen.
Okay. Let me go back to here. Let's share application window of this one. And here we go. All right, does that work?
We're back in business.
Okay, we're back in business.
Yes.
Thanks for hanging with us while we figured that out. Sorry about that, folks. So here is my basically on logging cluster. You'll see that I've got basically one daemon set, which is the one we basically have one deployment, which is Python logging, which is the thing that like I just built to demonstrate some logging capabilities, and then the Fluentd, which is our daemon set specifically for logging.
Right.
All right. Not running anything else. Right. But you can see that if I look at, for example, alpha cluster, right, you can see there's other stuff that's running.
Sure.
Right. So here's my Stackdriver agents namespace. It's running Heapster. It's running my Stackdriver logging agent and the metadata agent, basically for each node and as well as the cluster level.
Okay.
Right.
Got it. So these are the actual like pods.
Yeah.
That are carrying out. I imagine they're doing multiple different things. They're reading logs. They're querying the Kubernetes control plane to understand what pods are doing. They're probably doing a watch to understand changes as pods are updated, and then pushing all of this into that wonderful UI, right?
Yeah, that's exactly correct, right? So if we kind of go back to our architecture diagram, right?
Yeah.
Kind of based on what you just saw, right?
Yep.
So we've got our metadata agent, right? You can see our deployment and our daemon set, right? Basically getting information about, we've got pods running on nodes, and then we have things looking at services and basically communicating back to the Stackdriver resource metadata API.
Yep.
Then we have the Stackdriver logging agent talking to the logging API, and then we have the monitoring agent or Heapster talking to the monitoring API, right? It's kind of different things, collecting different pieces of information, talking to different Stackdriver APIs, and then the UI pulls it all together. Okay. So I did want to just cover that briefly, just to kind of really illustrate the difference between not just like what the UI is doing differently, because obviously that's important, but also what's actually happening in the cluster, so that you can understand about how, where that data is coming from.
Right. I mean, yeah, we have our own namespace. We have all these different pods being deployed into it.
Yeah.
It seems like before maybe we had a couple of things deployed in the kube system, but really that was about it.
Yeah.
So definitely see a difference as far as kind of the different workloads that are running to make this possible.
Yeah. So yeah, that's all I wanted to show you today.
Sweet. Looks like it's a little quiet on the questions today,
That's
but
right.
I have enjoyed watching this. I think I've learned a lot, and I'm really excited to test out and spin up a cluster.
Yeah.
And so that's a reminder. It's available now. You can go test this out for yourself, run some applications, maybe some more applications than Yuri was running in his cluster.
More than just hello
and,
world.
Nevertheless, it was awesome kind of seeing what you had prepared for us. And I think it's really only the beginning. This is just in beta and it already has a lot of cool features. I'd imagine that the product team there is really going to kind of put the foot on the pedal and
absolutely
accelerate this with more features.
Yeah. I'm sure there'll be more stuff announced at Next, which is coming up. I'm excited to see all the new announcements there.
Great.
And yeah, thank you. Thanks everyone. I really appreciate it. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, of course. And thank you all for joining. Don't forget to subscribe and check out our Meetup page, and make sure that you sign up and become a member, as we're now doing this type of format both on this YouTube channel as well as something called Cloud on Air.
Yeah.
So definitely keep an eye out. Yes, definitely subscribe, but also check out the Meetup page for the full authoritative list of these sessions.
Yeah.
Sweet.
Absolutely.
All right, everyone. Have a nice day, and thank you for joining.
All right. Thank you.